Hello everyone, I'm Tyler O'Brien and today I'm going to talk about the history of inefficient cars. So here's the issue. We all need cars. The problem that needs addressing is that cars are inefficient and historically have not progressed at the same speed as technology has. The world's reliance on cars has solidified its place in world culture, yet the impact is too great to continue forward. Now I'm going to talk about the last 100 years of the automobile and what can be done differently and what has been being done. So we'll start in the 1920s, rightfully so, because this year is 2020. According to a study at the University of Michigan, the average fuel economy for cars in 1923 was 14 miles to the gallon. And that's pretty significant, considering that where we are today, at least where you think we are today. That's alarmingly low, but again, this was 100 years ago. Throughout the entire decade, this was the first time that cars were really mainstream sold, and we sold around 26 million cars in the 20s. That is a lot of automobiles. This photo right here is a picture of a 1927 Duesenberg Model X, just for reference, just so you know what the cars back then looked like. So now we move on to the 30s. So this is a whole decade later. Gas mileage was on everyone's mind, relatively. We saw the average miles per gallon increase with the mass adoption of cars, and we now hit around 16 mpg. Now, cars by now were becoming literal pieces of art. They were becoming more streamlined, and automotive makers started understanding aerodynamics. And then also, what's really cool is modern engine design layouts were pioneered in the 30s, like what we have now, the V8 engine and the V12 engine. In these pictures up here, this is my family's 1932 Ford. It's not really stock anymore, but nonetheless, that's relatively what they started looking like. They got consolidated and flowy with their fender design. Now we move on to the 40s and 50s, and I'm lumping these two together because there was relatively, you know, small amounts of innovation that occurred, even though I'll discuss the two pictures in a minute. So they were relatively the same with their advancements. However, 3-speed manuals were developed, and this was in place to decrease engine RPMs at higher speeds, which increased MPG because now the engine's not working as hard, and noise was actually down significantly now that we're able to shift another gear. The issue was consolidating that into a smaller package because they didn't know what was going on. The gear sets were huge back then. Now, despite these improvements, however, people started started needing and wanting luxuries in their cars. It was no longer just a means to get to A to B. It was now personalization was coming out. They wanted comfy sofas and big chairs. So the relatively large weight that cars were starting to obtain somewhat negated the effects of all the technological advancements at the time and prevented gas mileage from going up. So it's kind of, you chuckle at it, but it's kind of funny. So to the right, this is a 1940 Ford Deluxe. So you see how big, flowy it carries on from the 30s. By the end of the 50s, and I purposely chose something at the beginning of the 40s and the end of the 50s. By the end of the 50s, you see a sports car. That is a Corvette. Now, it came out in 1953, nonetheless, so I picked a prettier looking one in my opinion. However, significantly smaller. They're made out of fiberglass. They're lighter. So now you start seeing the shift towards where cars got to in the 60s, and that is important. So, 1960s. In fact, I think this is, if not one of the most important decades. Granted, the next decade is extremely important as well. Those are the two, milestones and where we're at. But the 60s is super important because that's when the performance scene was real. That's when hot rodding became a thing, modifying became a thing, and cars were really obtainable and easy to be worked on. So the sacrifice, though, however, is fuel economy. So people started modifying and racing and getting these cars really fast, and the average man can work on them. Cool. Except now that automakers knew that and started making fast cars and didn't care as much. So average miles per gallon actually was at 13 mpg. This so far is the lowest miles per gallon. Keep in mind, 40 years ago, we were getting better gas mileage than they are today. However, cars were bigger, cars were heavier, cars were significantly faster now. Nonetheless, we're doing worse. And it wasn't a priority for automakers at all. They just did not, care. They were like, oh yeah, whatever, go for it, have fun. The picture I showed is an extremely rare car. So that's a 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona, and the color scheme is plum crazy purple, and it's an off white, but it's a cool white, and that is a phenomenal race car. First car to hit 200 miles an hour at the Indianapolis 500. Now I'll continue with the 60s because it's extremely important, and I got to bring up some other topics. So this is just a little fun facts, little tidbit things. 1964, the Mustang came out, and we all know what the Mustang is, and we've all seen them and been around them. And if you are even like remotely a car person, you've owned one, or someone you know have owned one. Now in 1964 alone, now I'll get to this point as well. 1964 alone, they built 308,000 cars, and in the second year of production, over 1 million Mustangs were already sold. That's huge. That's landmark, considering that's a 26th of every single car sold in 1920s. All right, so the sheer size of the amount of cars that are now on the road today, or back in the 60s, is astronomically larger than that of the 20s. So now not only are we getting worse gas mileage, but there's millions and millions and millions of more cars on the road. That is a significant problem. Now, if you take a history class, 1960s is Vietnam was going, but it hadn't really escalated to the full extent as to where we see it in the textbooks. So kids started leaving. Kids started getting drafted. That is important. That is, and you wouldn't think, but that's interesting, and I love that little tie-in. This picture right here is really cool. So when you think of a Mustang, you don't think of this car because this is $1 million car now. This is a 1966 Mustang GT350 race car that you can drive on the street. You could have purchased back in the day. And it's brandishing Wimbledon white racing stripes, which is an homage. Usually they're in white and with blue stripes due to the American racing colors of the time period. However, this one was reversed, and it is very, very valuable and collectible because of that. Let's move on to the 1970s, which, in my opinion, is now the most important decade of them all. So, this decade changed everything. Miles per gallon was at an all-time low. You didn't think it could get worse. 11.9 miles per gallon was the average. 11.9. Now, granted, this is the beginning of the 70s, and you could argue the fact that it's still theoretically the 60s, because the 60s doesn't end. It's not 1960 to 1969. It's like 1958 to 1972. That's the really, quote-unquote, the 60s. However, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say this is now the 70s, because it is 1970. So, it has never been at an all-time low. There are two things that had happened here. Vietnam was ending. We were kind of finally coming home from Vietnam, and then the oil crisis struck in 1973. Due to embargoes and things shutting us down from receiving what oil that we used and relied on, no one understood the impact that it would have. Well, now, not only were we consuming more fuel than ever to run our everyday cars, now there was no fuel. So the government had to intervene and step in and say, all right, this is terrible, because now they aren't selling domestic products. We started importing cars from other countries who, in turn, were significantly smaller. America was on this idea that bigger is better. So these cars were significantly smaller and more fuel efficient because they were lighter. Along with that, safety was now important. 1973, all the veterans came home, all the kids came home, got in their race cars, and started going ham. Well, it was one of the most dangerous years to be alive in cars. Deaths were at an all-time high, 28 deaths per 100,000 people. We're down to like 13, 14 deaths per 100,000 people. We're half that nowadays. So there were no safety regulations, seatbelts weren't mandatory, things like that. So the oil crisis really put it into play, but that caused to innovation. That caused to learning and stepping up, because now we had to conserve our oil and our fuel because we didn't have any. This picture is my personal race car. That's my 1972 Corvette, and roughly it gets around 6 miles per gallon. It's not, I know, right? Oof. It's not really a car you drive every day. It's pretty much a race car. So that's how I justify that, but we all have our vices. Now, let me move on to the 80s and 90s. And again, I'm going to lump these two decades together just because nothing spectacular happened in the 90s that didn't already happen in the 80s. So I will say that in the 80s, fuel injection now was mainstream. Carburetors were always a thing, but that was more of like witchcraft and just dump fuel into the car. That was like fuel, go, vacuum, rah. Now fuel injection with the widespread of computers, so the 80s is what you think of as the stereotypical computer age. You know, if you watch any films back then, the theme and the genres were very technology orientated. But now we move on to the 80s. So the 80s fuel injection was adopted, which was really cool. And this is actually the first time we hit the 20 miles per gallon mark. As in the whole decade, the average MPG was 20 miles to the gallon, 2021. So that's phenomenal. That's already a massive step. That was one of the biggest leaps, so to speak, because of what happened in the 70s and how hard automotive industry was hit by this oil crisis. They really had to change. Now, so fuel injection helped out. So computers were now telling each little fuel injector to give this little amount of fuel, made more power, and was significantly more efficient. The 80s also brought to the stage turbochargers. Now, turbochargers are like the snowboarding of this genre. You know, it was new. All the old people didn't like it. It was widely dogged on. It was never accepted until recent times. However, people were using them in cars to make more power, and the drag racing scene was really utilizing them with things like the Buick GSX and GNX and things like that. And I'll get to why turbochargers are important because automotive industry decided that it wasn't actually necessarily amazing for power, even though it is, but they also used it for efficiency reasons. These pictures, so my dad collects Mustangs, and then from right to left, we have a 1996, 1998 in the middle, 1998 in the middle, and then 1996 Mustang on the left. And this is in our yard. He has a few of them. I drive that purple one every single day. That is my go-to car, my newest car I own from the 90s. So, again, I'm going to lump 2000s and 2010s together. It's relatively stagnant, even though by the end of the 2010s, we have some amazing machines. However, in the beginning of the 2000s, interestingly enough, we're not going to see that big of a change in fuel efficiency rise because the sanctions from the 70s finally were lifted. 30 years later, the government said, I think we did a great job. I think we did well. So you're not going to see that big of a gap between miles per gallon increase like we did from the 70s to 80s. It won't happen. Now automotive makers were now able to just de-stress and say, all right, it doesn't have to be as stringent and restricted nowadays. So we got cars like this 2000 Saleen S7 and things like that where supercars kind of just got to flourish again because they can be as fast as possible. That being said, in the 2000s, we did hit 25 miles per gallon. And yeah, that's significant. It's not a 9 miles per gallon increase. It's close to like a 4 miles per gallon increase. Turbocharged engines now became mainstream. They were adopted widely by everyone and realized that they can, in fact, significantly help with efficiency because they reuse spent exhaust gases. There's no tax, so they don't cost any power to run. Whereas a supercharger, which is a power adder, these are all power adders, takes a belt and it taxes the engine. The engine loses power trying to spin this supercharger. A turbocharger, like I said, runs off exhaust. So it's already something that's going to get wasted and you're recycling that to make even more power. And what they can also do with it is at higher RPM speeds, you use significantly more fuel. Well, when you're compacting and compressing the air and changing the air-fuel ratio and adding more air than fuel at top end, there's less area for fuel to get in top of the cylinder. Meaning you're not going to use as much fuel and you're still going to make just as much power. Whereas if you didn't have this turbocharger, you would be spending more fuel to make the same amount of power. So automotive makers started finding that out and started widely using that in almost every passenger car nowadays. They can make a small engine significantly more powerful, more fun, and do more things. Now, by the 2010s, we saw a big jump. So 2010, 2020, 2019, we saw a 30 miles per gallon increase. We're at an average of 27 miles per gallon now. So it's close to 30. We're almost at that 30 mark. But nonetheless, we're getting there. But we're not. And that's an unfortunate thing. I believe that we should be significantly higher than that. This car at the bottom of your screen right here is the same color as that 1969 Dodge Charger, and this is a Dodge Challenger. This is a 2018 Dodge Demon. It's a Challenger Demon. First car to ever do a wheelie from the factory. I mean, we have cars do wheeling since like the 50s, but no, this is like you buy it, you can go do a wheel in your front yard. Like this thing is unreal and gets 12 miles to the gallon. It is the problem. It's what's lowering the average. So I move on. This is now we're in 2020, which is the year that we are still currently in. There are a lot of questions that going through this century of basic information, a lot of questions get arisen, and that's what somewhat inspired me to look into this. I initially saw it and I was like, what? Why? So let me cover them. So basically, one that I gathered was, how is it possible that we've only increased average efficiency of cars by 12 miles per gallon in the course of 100 years? 100 years. Most people don't live to be 100 years old. In 100 years, we've only found 12, 14 miles to the gallon out of our everyday cars. To me, that's unacceptable. That is mind-blowing. Do you know how much technological advances have happened in the 100 years? I mean, heck, in the 60s, 1969, on July 22nd, we landed on the moon. We got to a different planet, so to speak. And here we are, still running our cars as inefficiently as the day they rolled off the line 100 years ago. Like, I again, like I said, safety and weight and luxuries have increased the weight of cars, so cars are more efficient, but the needs and requirements have made them heavier, which negates that. But I move on. Now, why are people not caring as much? It seems nowadays that people are going to go buy a 2020 Dodge T-Rex truck and get 8 to 10 miles to the gallon. It's the most inefficient car you can purchase nowadays, now that is officially for sale as a new car. And it gets 8 to 10 miles to the gallon. Why are people okay with that? And I'm not trying to just say people buy them because they're inefficient. People just buy them because they can. And these questions will get answered, so I will move on. So, where can we go from here? What are our options to move forward from this? You can't just say, oh man, let's make more efficient cars. It's not that easy. What can we do to fix this? So there's a difference between moving forward and fixing what has happened. And then finally, when will we finally be in a position that is acceptable for our decade? When can we say the 2020s, we are this efficient? Because in my opinion, if I said 2010, we have 25 average MPG, I don't think that lines up. Considering I know the cars have been around for 130 years by that point, that doesn't line up. That seems way too low of a number. Now, there are always corporate greed. There's always companies involved. So who is responsible for this lack of innovation? There are people to blame and point fingers at. So let's answer this. Historically, we have had some major setbacks, and these are in order. So as I ask these questions, these answers will correspond with that question. Now, historically, we have had major setbacks, and this is a correlation that I personally found, and I've always loved and talked about just in my casual banter, actually. Some of the worst fuel economy corresponds to a major conflict in the world. If you look back at the numbers I found, the numbers correspond here. So World War II, 1939 to 1945, I lumped those 2 decades together. There was really no real advancement, and that's why we were spending significantly more of our time and resources on the war effort. We weren't thinking about what was going on back home. Now you take the Korean War, it's a short-ish kind of conflict, but nonetheless, after the Korean War ended, we saw the likes of General Motors making the Corvette, it was a really advanced piece of equipment because it was fiberglass, it was plastic, it was never metal, it was very light. It's a cool little sports car, and that was the creation of the sports cars, the Corvette, in my opinion. So 1953, when the war ended, that's what we got. Vietnam, and that's the big one. And you notice the cutoff. The end is 1973, the oil crisis, the highest death rate on public roads, and the worst fuel economy ever recorded. The country wasn't necessarily in a good state. It was a space race, so cars got this really cool, spaceship-like approach to it if you look at concept cars of the day. So we were in the space race. We were focusing on getting off this planet. We were focusing on beating the Russians, and we were focusing on occupying another country that, controversially, we didn't need to be in. And the country really suffered. The fuel economy was terrible. They didn't care. They were just like, yeah, yeah, they were busy with other things. It's almost like they couldn't multitask and they had zero time or desire to focus on sustaining our automotive industry into the future until they were forced to. They were forced to by the oil crisis. The mass adoption of gasoline has led to the decrease of price. So this is why my suspicions are that people don't care. People don't care because gas prices have never skyrocketed. It's interesting if you look at it from an economic standpoint, supply and demand. Supply has always been full. We're full supply. But demand has significantly increased because now there's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of more cars. There are 1 billion cars. There's one car per 7 people on Earth, or 8 people now, roughly. There are a billion cars on planet Earth now. You think there were a billion cars in 1926? No. So, gas prices have stayed constant with the rapid increase in the amount of cars on the road. And that to me, I get because supply's huge. We're never going to run out of. We will. Actually, that's incorrect. We absolutely will run out of supplies, and that is also the issue that people are neglecting to see. However, gas prices have just been stagnant, and in 2015, it was at one of the lowest figures it's been in the last 50 years. And that's why from 2010 to 2020, we only saw it, or from 2000, from the 2000s to the 2010s, we only saw a 2 mile per gallon increase in efficiency. And I think it's due to the 2015. People were able to say, oh, and what people's mindset is when it's cheap, they go buy more and more and more of it. And that's just how it works from a general perspective. So when 2015 rolled around and gas was at one of its lowest figures in 50 years, in half a century, a lot of people purchased it. So, alternative fuel source cars have always been in the back of the head. Since the 80s, we've seen people try electric cars, hydrogen-powered cars, things like that. People power cars on ethanol, methanol. There are alternative fuel sources. So, nitromethane. That's a whole different. That's not even relatable. That's super inefficient. However, electric cars are now finally hitting the world meta and very well could shut down this entire issue altogether. In the next few decades, I believe that electric cars will become the whole thing. However, we can't. This is how we're going to fix this, and I'll touch on that in a second. We could become more aware of how efficient some cars are. Noticing like the Dodge T-Rex that it gets 8 to 10 miles to the gallon in the city. That's I can't believe people would be okay with that. So if we were able to tell people and show people and reach out and ask people, is this okay? And raise public awareness and have people genuinely be pickier with their purchase. I think now people are slumped and people just buy it because it's the new thing. Buy! Rather than, I kind of want these features. If we were just a little bit more picky with how we bought things, we would, and nitpicked this and that and like why, or ask the question, why does it do this? I think that we'd be in a greater good. I think that we would start to innovate a little bit more because we would notice that people don't want that kind of stuff. Now, like I said before, with the mass adoption of electric cars, it's predicted that by the 30s or the 40s, that's 2040, 2030, we will finally be up to par with where efficiency of cars will be. And I'm not saying that electric cars will be 100% every car. What I'm saying here is that there will most definitely be gasoline cars. You can't just kick that bucket. That is not going away anytime soon. So we'll see. We'll still have fuel efficiency standards, even though electric cars are widely adopted. And I think that those cars, because people will have moved to electric, those cars will finally be as efficient as we need them to be. Because they're going to need to compete and prove that gas cars are better than electric cars. Electric cars are that driving force right now that's going to allow the gasoline engine to innovate. And finally, there are plenty of organizations that have their hand. Now, just this statement alone, after all, the more gas you buy, the more you have to purchase. What does that have to say? The more something you buy, the more you have to purchase. Like, the more gas you use, the more you have to buy. So, right then and there, the gas companies immediately have an advantage. They immediately have an excuse to lobby for car manufacturers and to remove government regulations on gas mileage. because they want to sell more. It's a capitalistic society. They want to make money. They're like, we're gonna make a crap ton of money. Here we go. Yeah, use gas. Yeah, they're incentivized to literally make sure that cars get the lowest possible miles to gallon. So they don't want to see this number increase. They're the antithesis of sustainability. They do not want people to purchase cars that save them money on gas. So that is immediately uh, all those organizations combined. There's never a good one, and they claim to be. They claim to move on to alternative fuel sources, and I think that the last possible moment they will shift over to survive. But other than that, they're not going to be happy about it. And then, so the lack of government regulation. Like I said, the government in 1973 was forced to move over and start, making sure that gas mileage was taken care of. They didn't want to. They really didn't. But then when they started noticing that cars were getting imported and that their cars weren't getting sold, the big Cadillacs were disappearing, they had to do something, and that's why they jumped in. And then they, like I said, they shut it off. Mere 30 years later, they said, "Nah, 2000s, we're done." And I think that's sad. I think that should have been kept up with. So here's a solution. I could talk all day. I'll start with other than saying buy an electric car, because obviously buy an electric car, it has its own inherent risks with sustainability, but from an immediate pollution standpoint or an immediate money saving standpoint, where you will see the effects on your day-to-day and your have it now mentality that is with our generation, that is the move. That is the way that we should be going forward. They're insane. They're more powerful. Their range has significantly increased. Charging speed has decreased. There's a boatload of benefits to it now. However, that's not what we're talking about. I do have a backup plan because, like I said, the gasoline engine isn't going anywhere until the last possible moment. They are not disappearing overnight, and there need to be major refinements associated with them if they were to A, compete with electric cars, and B, actually represent where our decade is technologically. Now, I've briefed over this again. The government in the mid-70s was forced to declare all automotive makers to equip special smog equipment, which in turn drastically changed the world of cars. A little recap here. Changed the world of cars. In 1975, a Chevrolet Corvette produced 150 horsepower brand new. And you don't need to know anything about cars to know that that is the lowest horsepower Corvette in history. That is terrible. From a hot rodding race car enthusiast perspective, that is terrible. 150 horsepower. I'll give you an example. 3 years before, which is the car that I own, my car produced around 400 horsepower. That's almost 4 times as much. In 3 years, we lost 4 times the amount of horsepower. That was because technology, they didn't know. They just slapped on a bunch of pumps and tried to suck the fumes out of cars. Kind of worked. Catalytic converters came out too. So 1975 was the first year of a catalytic converter. It kind of worked, but nonetheless, it didn't work from a performance standpoint. And I say this because no one wanted that. Those are the least desired cars ever. Nobody wanted that to happen. The auto industry never wanted that. They wanted to make fast and cool cars. I mean, look at how ludicrous the cars are from the late 60s, early 70s. Those muscle cars are insane. The people wanted to have powerful cars. Like I said, we just got out of the hot rodding era of the 60s. People have never gone faster. First car to hit 200 miles an hour, things like that. People wanted fast cars. They wanted to race cars. Everybody wanted to feel like Speed Racer. And then the government wanted to say that America made the best cars. We were exporting cars like crazy. We had the greatest automotive field ever. We had the big three, GM, Ford, and AMC. Things like that. And by the end of the 70s, we didn't have any of that. That infrastructure failed miserably, and we resorted to importing cars. So no one was incentivized at this point to help with fuel economy. And it happened. And it changed everything. So I'm just basically saying here is that we really should keep with the times, and we should try to raise some incentivize people to do certain things. So if we were to leverage technology and create a compromise where everyone wins, or even not even necessarily everybody, there will always be a loser. But if we actually attempt to compromise, then everybody would be happy and we'd be able to have a more sustainable way of transporting ourselves as individuals rather than riding bikes and scooters everywhere. Because cars do still have their place for longer distances than like 2 miles. The government should start understanding and implementing more regulations. I think them stopping their regulations on what's going on was okay. It wasn't negative in the sense in 2000s, but I think if they kept up with it and they started imposing different restrictions now that technology is finally caught up with cars, we would have significantly more miles per gallon. It could be something as simple as saying I hit 35 miles per gallon. If your car does not get 35 miles to the gallon, you can't sell that car here. The car companies would be pissed off, but they would say, all right, fine, and they would concede, and they would make a car that did that produced power. They would step up. Or we could even say something as if you make a car with 40 miles, or a truck with 40 miles to the gallon. Trucks are different. I'm going to bring it up though. If you make a truck that gets 40 miles to the gallon, you will get these incentives, and we will bail you out if you ever need help. Something as easy as saying just that would force the automotive field's hand and cause them to innovate and yet keep their customers happy and keep the government happy. Put someone in the middle. And I think that's where we need to do what we need to do. We have to talk about how feasible this is because it's easier for me to just say this than to really talk about it. Now, doing this and implementing 35 miles per gallon, for say, we'll keep that as a constant. It is feasible. It wouldn't affect the larger population. It would only affect the clique, like people like me, the car people, who, yes, we all have a negative idea of this, but in turn, it's necessary. You can't look away. You can't turn a blind eye to this. It's something that needs to be done. And we'll still have our old hot rods to race and play with. My 72 Corvette does not need to pass smog. Doesn't have to do any of the tests. It's a polluter. It absolutely is. But again, I'm not driving that hundreds of thousands of miles. I'm going to drive that maybe thousands, not even thousands of miles a year. It's something to have to go to car shows and to have fun with in a safe environment. So again, you can still have that. There's still like rules out there to allow people to experiment with cars and have a good time. But we need to adopt this to the wide population. Now, interestingly enough, this is where wrapping my head around, and I'm not going to go into extreme detail or I will lose you as my audience. But the cost of materials would be the same. It would utilize the same resources and equipment needed to work. It would literally be more of R&D and pushing towards that rather than, oh, we need to change this piece of hardware. It would all be the same. It'd all be internal in the combustion engine. It would never be something that you wouldn't notice a change, and it would still be workable by everyday mechanics. And finally, the average person will still purchase what car they want. They will still say, I want this, I want that, due to brands and things like that. They won't notice the change. The everyday person will not be there to notice a change other than that they're spending less money on gas. And they'll be happy about that. It'll be a win-win for them. Here's some of my inspiration. I'll wrap this up. So some of my inspiration is if you take a look at the Mauna Loa Observatory and how it's collected atmospheric CO2 over the last 50 years, 60 years, we see a trend. And they only started recording in the 60s. Unfortunately, I can't find statistics dating back to 1920s because, like I said, the space race was allowing us to gain this information due to launching satellites and getting otherworldly experience. You know what I mean? Like getting a third eye on what's actually going on. So I will use this chart, except that know that it's not just automotive, the automotive industry, automobiles. It's not just automobiles. It's everything. However, it's obviously correlated with the amount of cars that we've seen increase from 1 billion cars nowadays to 20 million cars in the 20s. With almost the same miles per gallon, speaking of. So this chart scared me. It's really, really scary to think that what our atmosphere is holding now is nothing even remotely close to what we were recording 70 years ago. So, just like a little thing, yeah, it's not sustainable. And if we were able to change even just one aspect of this upward slope, it would be a positive push, and I think cars would affect this drastically. Cars would be able to change this. So that will be it for this presentation. It was relatively lengthy, but I appreciate you following through. These are the sources I used, the academic journal that I followed. And if any questions and comments, please leave a message down below. Thanks again for your time and your patience. Hope you have a good day.